Way everyone, it's Leyton Schnellert, and I'm a professor here at UBC, and I'm so delighted to work in partnership with the team that we're going to introduce you to in a moment. I myself learn and I live and I research on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx people as a settler guest. The Syilx Nation is to this day and every day forward the rightful caretaker of this territory. And it's my obligation to acknowledge, to respect, and to learn from the Syilx and their knowledge, language, and history, as well from their ongoing relationship to the land and the natural world. The Syilx have taken care of their homelands for thousands of years, and now that I call this place home, it's also my obligation to aspire towards better understanding how to engage in respectful acts of decolonization, both personally and professionally. And you'll just see on the left-hand side, I'm so fortunate to be partnered with the Penticton Indian Band, working with Syilx scientists as we're engaging in floodplain reclamation work, returning plants to their rightful place and the symbiotic relationships. And if you saw the news in June, the monarch butterfly is extinct, and this is one of the sites where the monarchs have a symbiotic relationship with the showy milkweed. And so we've been planting showy milkweed with my grade 4 or 5 partner research class. So I'm grateful to be learning and living here and doing this work. And finally, my last job today before I pass the torch to the real leaders of this session is just to talk about the partnership work that's happening. Thank you, Cynthia, for partnering in this work. Dr. Cynthia Nicol has a research chair, the David Robitaille research chair, and so in math. And so there's a STEM work network that you can see that's a partner here. There's also the Indigenous Math Network that Joanne and Cynthia lead, Dogwood 25, which I'm still excited to hear more about, colleagues. The Ministry of Education has also provided funding for this series, and so we're very grateful to work with them. And then I'm fortunate enough to co-chair the Rural Education Advisory. And so part of the work we're doing here is recognizing that educators across this province are doing powerful work, and we can all decolonize our practice. And by sharing our work together, we create spaces for access and success for all learners. And I'll pass the torch. I don't know if you turn or pass the torch over to my colleague, Dr. Cynthia Nicol.
Thank you. I accept the virtual torch. So thank you for that good introduction, Leyton. And welcome everybody to our session. I'm Cynthia Nicol at UBC in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy. And I'm fortunate in this moment to be on the traditional territories of the Hunkaminam language-speaking people right here on what now is called the Fraser River, where it splits into the north and the south arm before meeting again in the Pacific Ocean. And I can imagine that the ancestors of this place lived with gratitude for the ability to collect food on the waterways and lands that I'm now residing on, and like in this image, and how Indigenous people continue to live on these lands in spite of or despite the harms of settler colonialism. And it reminds me of my own need for reciprocity to give back to the land as a kind of reciprocity to the living world. So we want to invite you now to introduce yourselves. If you haven't already had the chance to introduce yourself in the chat, and the lands that you are currently on, wherever you may be. So please feel free to write that in the chat, especially for those who are just joining us. So I'm honored to introduce my colleagues who are co-hosting and facilitating this session. You've met Leyton and you've met me now, but also joining us is Joanne Archibald, Kwang William, Janice Novakowski, and Stephanie LaFrance, all from UBC, the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And of course, I want to introduce you to Kaganjad. Kaganjad is, in the Haida language, means mouse woman. And Kaganjad is a supernatural shapeshifter. And she restores balance and equity. And according to Haida artist Billy Jovanovich, who made this design for our Indigenous Math Education Network, he says that Kaganjad kind of sneaks up on you like math does, to always lend a hand and to help out or to solve a problem. So Kaganjad, like mathematics, is always there, always helping. So let's think of Cug and Jad with us on this journey of trying to think more about and conceptualize and enact what culturally responsive math assessment might look like. So last year, we offered a series of webinar sessions that will be available to, they're all available to you, and we'll give you the link to that towards the end of the presentation. But there were 4 different sessions that we did. The last of them was around culturally responsive math assessment. And it was the interest in that last session that sort of has framed our sessions for this year in 2022 and 2023. So we're springboarding onto that, and it's in today's session that we'll start kind of unpacking these pieces to get a deeper understanding of the whole in terms of what culturally responsive math assessment is kind of generally. We'll start kind of with a general overview of that, and more specifically to the BC context, and then kind of explore a bit around what we mean by culturally responsive teaching and provide some examples of that, and then introduce some principles of Indigenous story work that can guide our work in exploring what culturally responsive math assessment could be or might be. And then we'll end with some actions that we can try out in our classrooms or wherever you are, or in your families or in your communities, some ways of trying to think about committing to some actions around what this could look like. And then we'll talk about how to share our work with each other so that we can always be learning together and alongside each other. Okay, so let's begin. Are you ready? You've hopefully got your tea or your coffee and your comfy chair, or maybe you're listening while you're walking, but we know you're not driving. So let's get started. So we want to start with questions that you might have. So what questions do you have about culturally responsive teaching in general, and maybe specific to mathematics and thinking about assessment? So let's just take a moment now to think of a question that you have that's been sitting with you, or maybe a question that has drawn you to this session, or what you're kind of hoping to learn more about, and just stick that in the chat now. And we just want to sort of see where we are as a collective, like, so we can get a feel for what everybody is thinking or doing. Since we're not all in the same room, we'll use the chat as a way to kind of help share our thinking.
I think one of the big questions that someone shared was, how is culturally responsive assessment different than what we're doing right now? And, that's very contextual, but we'll hopefully unpack some of those ideas throughout the series. We have some school leaders here that are hoping to share some of this learning with their staffs. So things that they can put into action at a staff level.
Yeah, it's nice to share the questions that we have so that you can see that there are others who are thinking, along the same lines, or that questions that you hadn't thought about before that inspire you to think, of more questions. So I love questions.
And I think there's one question coming up, like, what are some micro moves I can use to start in this work? And I think, it can be very overwhelming. And I think that idea of, like, what are your first steps and what is one thing that you could try? And our hopes are that you'll leave with some things to think about today. Well, not to just think about, but maybe something that you can try with students that you're learning with.
Yes, exactly. And starting with small steps, lots of small steps leads to a big step. And then those steps need even bigger steps. So, and we want to recognize too that this can be challenging, courageous work that can be very messy, and at times, feeling that we might not know where we're going with it, as a collective here. But we're going to work on this together so that we can think about how we can enact some of these ideas and principles. Okay, so let's, the questions can still come in. I'm going to move to the next slide, which is just really, again, kind of emphasizing the question that we are as guiding our work in terms of thinking about connections to land and place and community and culture as a way to think about culturally responsive assessment practices. So with that question alongside all the other questions that you have, I'm going to now invite Janice Novakowski to contextualize assessment kind of in a general sense, as well as more specifically to what it means in BC, especially for those of you who are joining us from outside British Columbia. So, Janice.
So as Cynthia mentioned, last year, our webinar series focused on culturally responsive teaching. And for those of you that are from outside of British Columbia, just a little context, in 2016, our provincial curriculum framework was reimagined, and Indigenous ways of knowing and being and worldviews were woven throughout and embedded throughout all areas of learning and the curriculum framework. And so there's been a lot of emphasis on pedagogy and instructional practices that are culturally responsive, learning on the land, learning with and through community, and being responsive to, children's identities, families, and cultures. So that has been a focus, and with a lot of things that are happening in the world now, as well as in our particular provincial context, this move towards thinking about assessment was really important. So other things happening, beyond curriculum that are part of the landscape are the legislation around UNDRIP, so the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples Act. Also the work that has been going on around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the actions around that has been embedded in practices in school districts and schools and universities for years now. And then, as I mentioned, in 2016, the redesign of the curriculum had Indigenous worldviews, and still does, perspectives embedded within that redesign. And one of the real drivers of that was FNESC, which is our First Nations, the provincial First Nations Education Steering Committee. And they developed the First Peoples Principles of Learning in collaboration with First Nations around the province and educational leaders. And that has really framed courses as well as understanding around pedagogy. And then parallel to that, so there's sort of the Indigenous perspective. And then there's also been really at the forefront in many districts in our province is EDI work, so equity, diversity, and inclusion work, sometimes now known as JEDI in many districts, so adding that justice piece, so justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and acknowledging that many of our districts and communities in our province are very racially and linguistically and culturally diverse. And so paying attention to that whole landscape has been at the forefront of the work of many districts in the last few years. So these are just some of the sort of, again, big picture things that are happening, that are framing some of the questions teachers are asking, community members are asking, and that are informing the decision making and our practice in schools. So in thinking about all of that information, I'm just going to do a very quick flyover of sort of what's been happening in British Columbia around assessment in mathematics and numeracy. So as far as I could go back, which was 1876, through 1973, there was pretty standard, achievement assessments as well as IQ tests in the area of mathematics. So really reading, writing, mathematics. And then in 1975, there was a revisioning in the provincial government, and a provincial learning assessment program began for grade 4, 8, and 12. And that was standardized assessment, but unlike many other jurisdictions around the world, it was still relatively low stakes in terms of assessment. It was to give the system, to give teachers information about students, their classes, the schools. High stakes provincial exams, those standardized achievement exams, were reintroduced in 1984, which happens to be my grade 12 grad year. And that was worth 50% of our mark for Math 12 and English 12 and Lit 12, et cetera. It was very high stakes in terms of university entrance, et cetera. And there were scholarships aligned with those. So that was in 1985. And then I'm not going to date myself that much. And then at the same time, in terms of curriculum, We had things which were called originally intended learning outcomes, and then they morphed into prescribed learning outcomes. And those were what are now called learning standards, the things that teachers had to teach, assess, and then report on or communicate student learning about. There was some performance-based assessment around that, particularly in primary, where the scale and the language was around fully meeting expectations. Intermediate had letter grades that were meant to be descriptive, and graduation program for here is grade 10 to 12, used percentages, aligned letter grades. We also had foundation skills assessments in grade 4 and 7 and 10. Again, very low stakes, but informed the system. In 2002 was the first time the term numeracy was used in our province in a ministry document, and that was with the numeracy performance standards. And in BC, we define numeracy a little bit different than the rest of the world. So numeracy is the application of mathematics to new contexts or other areas of learning. So looking at numeracy in science and social studies and applying mathematics to help us understand the world around us. And that's where there's this connection to culturally responsive pedagogy in terms of using mathematics as a lens and as a tool to understand issues and events that might be coming up in our students' lives or in our communities. And then again, more provincial exams. And then this is where we are now. Again, our curriculum was redesigned in 2016 and reimagined with lots of input from stakeholders across the province. And numeracy and literacy are considered the two pillars of the redesigned curriculum. And then Indigenous worldviews and perspectives are embedded throughout the redesigned curriculum in mathematics specifically. In our K-12 learning standards, we have specific curricular competencies that are specifically connected to place and the land, culture, and community. And so that's where many of those Indigenous worldviews, perspectives, and connections are in place as in curricular competencies. So in 2016, we had moved to standards-based assessment. We do have a new reporting order that will be in place next year. And so there's this real impetus now to make sure that we're all sort of in that place in terms of assessing student learning based on the learning standard, as opposed to quizzes or tests or tasks and adding up those marks, for example. So many of you will know about standards-based assessment, but it's really focusing on assessing the learning. And so what we understand as learning and what we understand as mathematics, to me, is at the crux of this in terms of culturally responsive pedagogy and assessment. We still have the foundation skills assessment for grade 4 and 7. Graduation, grade 10 has a numeracy assessment that's required for graduation, but it doesn't affect their marks. It goes on their transcript. And then coming this December in British Columbia, we will have the K-12 literacy, as well as numeracy new performance standards that will support teachers in assessing this connected and application of mathematics to other areas of learning. So I sort of alluded to this, but this idea that, we have to really, and I know many of you are joining us from outside of BC, so, make connections to your context. We have to think about how we value and how we define what mathematics is. And with many of our students and our families, we need to honor and value the funds of knowledge and the understanding of cultural perspectives on mathematics that they might bring into our classrooms, but also expanding all of our understanding of where mathematics is experienced and how we can use it as, again, a lens or a tool to understand the world around you. So we've got some images up here from across our beautiful province, and inviting you to think about, where do you see opportunities for mathematical exploration, investigation, and adventure? So what questions emerge for you and bubble up in terms of like, yes, I could count those cones on the tree, but what other mathematics might I connect to? Or how might I use mathematics to think about this? Or what mathematics might I be engaging in the process of weaving with cedar? Or thinking about the tides. So, but have a look at those images, or think about a place near you where you're joining us from, or a cultural practice in the community where you live and work, and think about, where are there opportunities to do mathematics, experience mathematics in that particular context? This is just a bit of a quiet reflection and making these connections in terms of how can we expand our thinking about what mathematics is. And that middle picture there on the top is just down the street from where I live, where the river meets the Salish Sea. And, not everyone knows that there's lots of tides involved with rivers and the riverbanks. And we're just coming out of drought here right now. And so that's really impacting the depth and the height of the river, and also then the animals that live around the river. So lots of connections in terms of data and temperature and measurement that I personally make when I'm walking along the river, as I often do, but making some connections to the place. And that's one of the reasons, why we continue to do land acknowledgements and extend them to make those personal connections for ourselves and our experiences. So again, expanding our understanding of what mathematics is so we can see different possibilities and openings for mathematics instruction, but then also that aligned assessment. So what does that look like? And that's one of the things that we want to explore in this particular series. At this time, before we go into sharing some supports for you in terms of what can culturally responsive teaching look like in mathematics, and then offering some of the work that we've been doing in our province and around a framework that can help you think about this as our first go at this, as the first session of a 3-part series, thinking about our students and thinking about what does it mean to be good at math and what values and biases we bring to our thinking about that and acknowledging that. Think of a student who is good at math, or what we perceive to, there's so many things around bias and perception and assumptions. What do they know and what can they do? That student that, other teachers may say, oh, they're really a strong math student. What makes them say that? What makes them think that? And then that leads into us thinking about what math do we value? What ways of knowing and doing are we valuing when we're making those judgments and those statements? So think about that. And then leading into that big question, as we think about what mathematics is and how students show what they know about mathematics, how can we explore mathematics, assessment of students thinking and doing mathematics in some different ways, and with some choice in terms how students can share what they know and what they can do. Add some thoughts about those questions. And again, this is part of building our community together. There's over 100 of you joining us today. And, we will see you again in January, and we're going to keep adding layers onto this. And we hope that you'll be sharing some of the things that you've been reflecting on and trying. And these are some questions to sort of set the stance for the rest of the session. So thank you.
Well, we've talked a bit about assessment, talked a bit about math, and now we'll talk about the culturally responsive teaching part of it. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of culturally responsive or culturally relevant or culturally sustaining approaches to teaching. And these have really been around for some time. And American educator Gloria Ladson-Billings wrote about this back in the early 1990s, when she noticed that Brown and Black students often received a deficit-based education. And then she did some research that looked at how successful teachers often used a reframing of education that focused more on academic, like high expectations for students and helping students appreciate the culture, their own cultures, as well as the cultures of others. And then also looking at more kind of critical consciousness, socio-political consciousness, taking learning outside of the classroom to the society. So we have a reading list for you that includes these books and other items that we'll share with you. But thinking about culturally responsive math education, particularly in rural and Indigenous communities, is really very kind of new, and it's receiving more attention. We have this book that came out in 2020. It's on the left there, and also a book or a mathematics teacher that focuses on culturally responsive math teaching and practices. that is just came out in October of 2022. So you can see that this work has been around for some time. So what we're thinking about here is a question around what is culturally responsive math teaching being responsive to? And so we want to suggest that it's building on some of these ideas that Lansing Billings suggested in terms of thinking about students' cultural communities, their multiple identities, current issues that students are experiencing in their communities and with their families, both locally and globally, and an education that contributes in some ways to family and community thriving. And that this responsiveness isn't just one directional, that it's very reciprocal. It's very sort of systems-based and ecological in its structure. So we're also, as Janice kind of gave a bit of an overview of thinking about Indigenous pedagogies and perspectives and practices within our curriculum, we're drawing upon these that tend to be more interconnected and holistic to try to think and deepen our understanding of culturally responsive teaching. And then, what does that mean for thinking about assessment? So let me just give you some quick examples that teachers across the province have been working on in terms of culturally responsive math teaching. So first, I'll share just a couple examples from some BC teachers, some amazing BC teachers, Sandra Fox in Vancouver and Carol Bob in Hazelton and Cassie Dusdell in Northern BC and Terrace. They collaborated on a project that used these stories written by Indigenous authors as a way to open up mathematical investigations, and later to show how story can be like threaded through any of these investigations. And here, students, after reading the story Raven Brings Light, compared the amount of light in various communities in BC that they received, and used mathematics to measure and represent these amounts. And you can kind of see the difference in the time schedules there with the corresponding to the red dots in the map. And then after they analyzed the results, they decided that it was kind of unfair and unsafe that some communities started and ended their school days in the dark. And that led students to writing a letter to their member of parliament requesting that we keep daylight savings time when that time of the year came where we put the clocks ahead an hour. So just one example. Here's another one with another brilliant teacher, Jen Whiffin in Coquitlam. She prepared a series of lessons around areas in her community that were the result of settler, colonialized, clear-cut logging. And she had students and teachers think about studying the large stumps of ancient trees, and using mathematics, students were able to then kind of explore and kind of think more about, what happened here? Why are these stumps here? And what can we learn from these stumps and the practices that led to this? And then what should happen in the future? What could future logging practices look like, and what would be more sustainable? And then working with Jen Whiffin, working with colleague Joy Fast, and Joy is in Delta, they both prepared a series of videos where the stories are not just oral or written stories, but the stories resided in the land itself. And in this case, looking at waterways, and they explored how being awed by water can open up possibilities for mathematical exploration. Another example is with Leighann Rogers on Haida Gwaii, and she did some amazing work with students in the class that she was working in, where the families explored, the families and the students and their families explored community oral and visual stories of Wasco. And you can see Wasco engraved on this signpost. And through the exploration, they looked at the mathematics, and that provided opportunities to learn both more about Wasco and traditional oral stories from the community, and also about mathematics and proportion. And then finally, an example here by Dr. Stan Manu, who's a professor at the University of the Fraser Valley. And he found last year with a volcano erupting in his home country of Tonga, that it led him to beating the disaster as part of this national beating project that we had. So he actually beated the disaster and explored the mathematics to help share a bit more about the story and his own experience with this explosion. And then he made these hypersquares that now kind of changed his understanding and thinking about mathematics and beating, but also the landscape of his own country. So across all these examples, I'm just going to use this C-star as a way to sort of show that all of these examples of thinking about culturally responsive teaching focus on students learning about math in their own community and culture, about bringing their culture to the classroom, and the learning of other cultures beyond their own, of engaging in some kind of critical consciousness to take their knowledge beyond the classroom to try to think about how to make a change or respond to the world, make it better, about learning about their community and land and place, as well as about building relationships. So now if we take all of that and well, yeah, I have this other slide, sorry. I'm just thinking about how some of this can also be summarized in a model that we've created and have used over the years. It's called the PAIRS model, and it focuses on teaching in response to thinking about place and action and inquiry, relationships, and Indigenous story work. And so if we think about all of this in terms of, what would this mean for assessment? What if we could use some of these ideas to think about and imagine culturally responsive math assessment? What could that look like? And so the last aspect of that PAIRS model is S, which is story work. So it's this aspect, Indigenous story work principles, that we see promise for framing our exploration of math assessment as culturally responsive. So I'd like to now introduce or pass to Joanne Archibald, and she'll introduce us to Indigenous story work. So Joanne.
Great. Swayal, everyone. It's great to be joining. How many of us? 113 of us all here today, and I'm situated on the beautiful lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and grateful for the stewardship of the Indigenous peoples, so that all of us living in this area of Vancouver can enjoy the beauty of the mountains and the ocean as they greet each other every day. Now, just imagine, I am from the Stalo people, Coast Salish peoples, and we often have our cultural gatherings in our longhouses and other facilities today. But as I was growing up and attending some of the ceremonies and gatherings held in longhouses, I would often hear these words said by the person who was going to direct the work and the gathering. And I would hear the words, "My dear ones, the work is about to begin." And when those words were said, those of us who were the guests, we would stop our visiting and we would then pay attention to the work that was about to happen, our cultural work, which could be many, many different areas, namings, passing on the history of places, passing on good teachings, many, many different purposes for gathering. And later on, when I was thinking more about then Indigenous traditional and life experience stories and how we might learn from and with these in the research that I was undertaking, I remembered those words, "My dear ones, the work is about to begin." And I thought, with our stories then, with the impact of colonization and indigeneity not being valued, especially in education, and with that, our stories, which are a core part of our Indigenous knowledge systems, I thought our stories needed to be valued once more, that we needed to do that, those of us engaged in education. So I thought about putting together the notion of story with work, so that when we would hear the term story work, we would then pay serious attention to working with stories, to learn from and with the Indigenous, traditional, and life experience stories. So for a long time, I learned from Indigenous elders, especially from the Stalom, from my home territory, and Coast Salish elders, and many other elders and cultural knowledge holders. And I learned from them, you know, about the importance of taking care of the stories, so that eventually the stories take care of us. And to help do this work in a good way, as we often say today, that there are these 7 principles that you see on this slide that I think can help us do this good work, this good story work. And the 4 principles, the reverence, reciprocity, respect, and responsibility, I think of these as ways to get us, to get me, to get, you know, you as educators ready to engage with the stories. And these principles, perhaps teachings, we may call it, help guide us, help guide us in our thinking and in our actions. And in this culturally responsive assessment series, we will deal further with these 7 principles. But today we'll focus on 2 of them that relate to reverence and reciprocity. And, you know, from particular elders, you know, the principle of reverence came up for me when I would observe them in their interactions with others, you know, when they told stories, that they had a particular deep respect, and more than respect, an openness to appreciating the power and the beauty of stories. And sometimes some elders would engage in perhaps the cultural ceremonies, different forms of our spirituality. And so this principle of reverence can mean many different things, and it can be very subjective to us as individuals. And, you know, from my interactions and learning from the elders, whenever they would talk about the stories, and especially stories with children, I would get the sense of that reverence that they had, that love for children, and the wonder and awe that might come when we look at our children or our grandchildren. And that's what this notion of reverence, I feel, is about. It's a way to help us start to appreciate the meaning of this principle of being open to experiencing wonder and awe. So I invite you to think of a moment where you have experienced that wonder and awe, perhaps being in nature when you see a sunset or a sunrise, or particular mountains that when you look at them, you just have that feeling of awe. In what Cynthia shared just before these slides, where various teachers, you know, had shared some of their culturally responsive approaches. I want to relate to some of those experiences in relation to these ideas about experiencing wonder and awe. And the videos that Jen and Joy developed with water, and where through their video, by seeing and hearing and feeling, you know, that the impact of water in different environments, to maybe ask the question, what stories do these waterways tell? And, you know, what can we learn from water? And relate that to mathematics education, but to be able to be open. And I think that's the important thing I want to emphasize here. It's getting ourselves ready to engage, you know, with stories or with these principles, so that then we can become open to thinking about broader forms or approaches to math assessment that somehow bring together community, culture, and math education. And by doing that, we can honor the students' funds of cultural knowledge that they bring to school. The example of Leighann from Haida Gwaii, who used the Wasco story, comes to mind, where at Haida Gwaii, many of the children, both Haida and non-Haida, know about Wasco. And that picture where there's a particular area, you know, where Wasco is said to have traveled, and the carving that you saw, that was one of the places. And so Leighann, through her teaching, then honored the knowledge that students had about Wasco. She provided lots of opportunity in the class for students to tell what they knew about Wasco. So in one sense, it reinforces what they know. It brings it into the school in an exciting way. And then students can build on that knowledge. They can share it with others, and others can learn more, perhaps if they didn't know particular stories about Wasco. And through this work, she had the students develop different approaches to Wasco that I relate to the mathematics, the proportion, the fractions, and other thoughts about the Wasco as a supernatural being and what could be learned from Wasco. And at the same time, also being open to how students learn, and giving them the space and time, the opportunity to be out on the land, near the water, you know, engaging with nature in some way. And with reciprocity, you know, with this particular principle, the you know, this is about sharing, about in a way it is often in an Indigenous teaching that I've learned, you know, is that when you have had the opportunity to learn something from someone, then it's also your responsibility then to pass that teaching, that knowledge on to others. And it becomes, well, a responsibility, but it is a way to keep that knowledge going, and a way to reinforce cultural knowledge. And that part of this, so that we as individuals can be learners and can be teachers, that we can have both those roles. And when we think of teachers, that of course humans are teachers, but more than humans can also be teachers. like the example of Wasco as a supernatural being can be a teacher. The example given about Raven Brings the Light, which is a storybook written and told by Roy Henry Vickers, an Indigenous artist and educator. And so that Raven can also be a teacher. And in that example, Sandra used that story, and where students were learning about daylight and the hours when it was sunrise, sunset in different communities, and thinking about what does that mean if the time changes and it's dark in a particular community until about 10:30. Well, how does that affect their lives? Or, it's difficult to walk to school when it's dark. And so the students then took that, what they were learning, that learning that was sparked by Raven, and they applied it to thinking about different communities and doing their math, but then finding a way that they could contribute in a way to improving lives, just like Raven did in that story. That's why Raven brings the light, to help people living in darkness have some light. And the students in Sandra's story were then able to share, how they did their math, what they learned, and then they also wrote letters to take action in a way to reinforce what they were learning. And with reciprocity, then it also relates to ourselves as teachers, and the teachers that were highlighted previously have been involved with the work that Cynthia and I and Janice and many others have been doing for a few years. And now they are sharing what they have learned through webinars, through conference presentations, through being mentors now to others. And we find that by doing that, we create an extended family, a family who cares for one another, who nudges each other when we think, wow, you should think about this, or you forgot this important question, or why don't you ask this? But we also support each other, when sometimes, it's really hard to change a system, and we need to have support in the ways that we think about that. So I think that here, this reciprocity, and what we're doing within this particular webinar series is inviting you to think along with us about, now here are culturally responsive pedagogies, and we are now focusing some of the light onto culturally responsive assessment, and we're only in this beginning process. But it is important for us to be able to take time to get ourselves ready and to engage in these principles, and to understand them and to live them in ways. We've provided lots of ideas, perhaps examples, certainly lots and lots of questions. And so we thought now it might be time for you and us to be able to reflect a bit, to think about, what have you seen in this presentation to date? What have you heard? What have you felt? What have you learned? What are your reactions to any of this? Because it can be overwhelming. So we want to give you some time now in the chat to be able to share something that maybe has sparked an idea for you, maybe has posed a question that you feel you have to engage in, or think about, how will you get yourself ready to be open to the wonder and awe of students learning?
Yeah, feeling inspired to make time for outdoor learning and land-based learning.
Thank you. Because we found this has been one that we've loved, that many of the teachers, even those in urban settings, have places that they can go, even in their schoolyard, that can be good for learning. Oh, and one thing I forgot to say, just please keep putting your comments in, is that when the students have been outdoors or doing project learning, often a comment they'll say is, are we really doing math? Because they're doing math differently. They're not doing worksheets. They're not doing, math from a textbook at that moment. It's not to say they don't ever, but for some of these activities, it broadens math experience and learning. And I think that's one where they love doing math this way, through experience, through projects, through stories.
So what you're saying, Joanne, is that the pedagogy of the teaching is interwoven with thinking about the assessment, because we need to be thinking kind of more broadly about the kinds of tasks or activities or projects that we ask students to work on, as a way to think about this idea of culturally responsive math assessment. So it isn't only assessment, but it's also thinking about the culturally responsive teaching part of the assessment.
Yes, yes, exactly. And also thinking about how how can we think about students learning that, or the way of assessment that actually captures what the students are learning there. And some of the comments, and it is connected, it isn't a separate activity at all, and that I think some of the comments that have been posted here of kind of having patience to kind of slow down, to listen to what students are saying, to give them time to talk, to give them time to think. Sometimes silence can help with that thinking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's a challenge when we put ourselves in the busy day of teaching with all the demands and the institutional constraints that we have, that we also think that we need to respond to. So trying to figure out how we might build this into our practice, not so much as an add-on, but as Joanne said, as a way of being in relation with our students, and mathematics and the place and the land, is something we're trying to explore further here in terms of what that could look like with assessment.
Yeah, and other comments too that relate to some of what we're saying is that math is integrative rather than isolated. That relates to that interrelated principle too in Indigenous story work, and that bringing in the local context, the local Indigenous stories that in here connect to new and old ways of learning math. So it is connected. Story, Indigenous story is not in isolation from what is learned. For example, it's not just there to introduce something and then you continue on with math and don't go back to the story at all, but the story is a guide to, when you think of this idea, story can be a teacher. Well, how can that be? Right. And so I think to me, that's an exciting question and challenge.
And to extend that, to think about teacher as beyond the human, so that idea of thinking about land as teacher, earth as teacher, water, those ancient stumps as teachers, lots of places we can think about story. And it isn't only a written story, can be, but it could be experiential stories, oral stories. Yeah. So we're trying to think again, sort of broadening that invitation to broaden our thinking about who is teacher and what is who might be a story. And some of this slide might capture some of those things that are being put in the chat right now in terms of thinking about, what kinds of places matter when we're trying to learn more about what our students can say and do. What does that environment actually look like, the physicalness of it as well as the social aspect of it, and what does it mean from my perspective as teacher as well as what's available to my students. So thinking about the place itself, thinking about relationship in terms of the nature of that interaction, the choices that students might have to share what they know and can do, being able to think about assessment practices that enable the whole child, to share them whole selves in that process and to be able to extend that. And thinking about how assessment can shape identities. We know it can shape identities that are emotionally destructive because there's so many people that do not like mathematics, or the experience that they've had with mathematics has been traumatic, as well as thinking about how to reshape identities that are healthy and strong and focus on well-being. Thinking about interaction in terms of how we might ask and invite a response to our questions in a way that gives students space to share their stories in lots of different kinds of ways. So they might act it out, they might use a poem, or they might be able to be outside and use some of the materials around them outside to be able to share what they know. We tend to privilege one way of knowing, which is often a written test. And we can also learn more about our students through observation, through story, through performance. There's many ways that we can think about this, and we hope that we can try together and be able to think more about what these are offering us. And then thinking about, whose math is actually being assessed. Where does that math lie? Like whose mathematics is being privileged? So we know there's a curriculum, but what is the curriculum? What is the mathematics in that curriculum that we're asked to teach, and what other kinds of math we focus on? So that idea of what's being excluded and included is important. And then finally thinking about this idea of the complexity of it all, the messiness of it, that and the interdisciplinary opportunities that assessment might have that can connect students to their community and families, and for that resilience and thriving. So our question around connections to community, land, place, and story in terms of helping us think about culturally responsive math assessment and how we might begin to think about and enacting some of these principles of story and Indigenous story work, in particular, reverence and reciprocity. So we're asking you between now and when we meet again in January, and if you're not able to meet again in January, the session will be recorded, but we would love for you to try out some of these ideas in your own context, whether it be in the classroom or whether you be at home with grandchildren or children and working together to think about actions towards reverence and reciprocity. So thinking about increasing your own awareness and openness to listening and creating spaces to be awed by students' thinking and what they might bring to that, and doing that in different ways. I just have 3 here that you could experiment with in terms of the structure of the learning space, different ways to design the question and the prompt that is responsive to students, responsive to the mathematics, responsive to the community, and what the cultures that students bring with them. Or thinking about attending to the different kinds of relationships that you're creating with students through this assessment, and how that might seed curiosity and wonder and care and kindness and love and a lot of different emotions that we often think that are not a part of assessment, but kind of open up this idea of thinking about what assessment could be and might be. And then also thinking about reciprocity. So you could focus on reverence, or you could focus on reciprocity, or you could focus on both. But in terms of reciprocity, thinking about designing opportunities that support the reciprocity of teaching and learning, where we as teachers become students of our own students, and our own students might become teachers. So placing ourselves in the position of student so that we might be open to learning about what our students bring, even though we might not agree with the idea, but being open to listening to it, being open to understand, so that we can ask the most respectful questions that might come by really attending to that moment in our students. So these are the two kind of action commitments we're offering, and we're hoping that you could take up one of these or both between now and when we meet again in the end of January. And we have a Padlet for you. Right now, though, there's going to be a Zoom poll that's going to come up for you that we're hoping that we can get a little bit of feedback from you on. And so maybe there it is. Good. So just 3 questions there that you can answer. And while you're answering the poll, I'm just going to put up this slide that's part of our Padlet. So we have a Padlet, and the link will be in the chat, or you can use the QR code here and look at it on your phone. But this is a place that you can go to access any of the resources that we have shared with you today. So there's all the reference lists as well as websites, and the webinars that we had last year that I mentioned. And then we'll add some key ideas for this session, some of the slides from our key ideas for this session in the Padlet, as well as some of your questions. We'll maybe just pool the questions and put them up in maybe a visual format in the Padlet as well. You can see there the 2 activities that we have set there for sharing your experiences with reverence and sharing with reciprocity in terms of the actions. So taking a moment to be able to think about those between now and January, and then just posting a short little reflection or an experience in the Padlet, so that we can begin to talk about those when we meet again in January. And then I guess just to wrap up, I want to share our contact information so that you can email us if you have any questions or thoughts or anything further that you'd like to connect with. And to recognize again Kangan Jad, who's been with us for the last hour and a bit, kind of helping us out think about culturally responsive math assessment, and this kind of holistic way of thinking about how a culturally responsive math assessment might place us in a different kind of relationship with mathematics, with our students, with community, and help us think and learn more about each other in a good way.
Stephanie has put that, I think that's part of the Padlet, right? Stephanie, do you want to tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, of course. So I will drop again the link to this resource list. It's a list of books and articles that are really helpful for sort of starting to think about these ideas of cultural responsivity, not just in terms of education, not just in terms of mathematics, but also assessment, and how we move from culturally responsive education and instruction to that assessment piece that tends to be a really challenging part that teachers tend to have to navigate.
And then as we add more to this, it's a link to a Google Doc, so they will be refreshed, I guess, as we kind of move through this series. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Look forward to hearing more about our collective work in this journey together.